Now that we have many, many more assembled with us, I again want to welcome you to tonight's event, Rachael Cerrotti, We Share the Same Sky. This event is presented by TOH Arts and Culture in partnership with USC Shoah Foundation. I, for those who have just joined, am Diana Wyan. I am the Artistic Director at Temple Israel of Hollywood, and this program is part of our ongoing series of performances and conversations that evolved out of our core belief that culture is illuminated, shared, and advanced through the arts. It also kicks off Rachael Cerrotti's month-long residency at Temple Israel of Hollywood, during which she'll be offering workshops, talks, and a photography exhibition in Schwall Hall. Before I introduce Rachael, she and I would like to acknowledge the land upon which we find ourselves. I want to recognize that I am joining you from, and our temple in Los Angeles is situated on the traditional and unceded lands of the Chumash, Tongva, and Kizh peoples. Rachael is joining us from her home in Portland, Maine, which is situated on the lands of the Wabanaki, the Akosisco, and the Abenaki. These communities have stewarded the land throughout the generations, and they continue to do so. Now, it is with great joy that I introduce our artist in residence, Rachael Cerrotti. She is an award-winning author, photographer, educator, and audio producer, as well as the inaugural storyteller in residence for USC Shoah Foundation. For over a decade, she has been retracing her grandmother's Holocaust survival story and documenting the echoes of World War II. In the fall of 2019, she released her critically acclaimed podcast titled We Share the Same Sky about this story. It was listed as one of the best podcasts of 2019 by HuffPost, as a show we love by Apple Podcasts, and a reader's pick by Vulture magazine. In addition, it received a literary award from the Missouri Review. The show was the first ever documentary podcast to be based on a Holocaust survivor's testimony and is now being taught in classrooms worldwide, accompanied by educational resources developed by USC Shoah Foundation's Eyewitness and Echoes and Reflections. Her memoir, also titled We Share the Same Sky, was published in August of 2021. It received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and was listed as one of the best books of August by Apple Books. Rachael, welcome.
Hi, it's so nice to be with you. Greetings from Maine.
Well, thank you so much for being here to share your grandmother's story with us and do so in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So, January 27th, today, is the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and Birkenau. And it was designated by the United Nations General Assembly as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today, we are joined by millions around the world to honor the 6 million Jewish victims and millions of other victims of the Holocaust in Europe, and to individually and collectively reaffirm our unwavering commitment to counter anti-Semitism, racism, ableism, and other forms of intolerance that may lead to identity-based violence and genocide. I want to recognize that this year's International Holocaust Remembrance Day comes just 2 weeks after Jewish worshipers were taken hostage at a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas. And I invite you at this time now to share in the chat the names of those you hold in your heart and you commemorate tonight, so that we too can hold them in our hearts on this important day of remembrance. Thank you. Feel free to keep adding their names if you'd like. I hope you'll also join me now, and let's collectively take a moment of silence for the 11 million people that were murdered during the Holocaust. Thank you. It's so important that we listen to, share, and experience one another's stories. so that we not only hold their memories in our hearts, but we also carry them forward in our bodies, our words, and our actions, which is why I am so glad that Rachael is here with us tonight. Elie Wiesel said, "Out of despair, one creates. What else can one do?" And Rachael has created. And I want to acknowledge before turning things over to Rachael that today is a complicated day. Today is a complicated day, and it's in the midst of a pandemic. And I am moved and grateful that we are all gathering here, that you are here with us, joining us virtually. And one reason in particular that I want to raise of why it's particularly complicated is because today at once marks not only International Holocaust Remembrance Day, it's also Rachael's birthday. So Rachael is joining us from Maine, where she is also celebrating her birthday. And Rachael, I have to wonder if perhaps this complicated blending of things is kind of to remind us that being human requires that we often hold both the joy and the sorrow at the same time. So I think it's wonderful that you are here with us. I wish you a happy, happy birthday. And thank you for being here to share your grandmother's story with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's very meaningful to actually share my birthday with this commemoration day. So joy and sadness go hand in hand. All right. Well, thank you to everybody for being here. It's so wonderful. And I look forward to just a few weeks away being out in Los Angeles, where the weather is much warmer, because we're gearing up for a snowstorm here in Maine. So tonight I am going to share with you the visual journey into a piece of this work. I have been documenting my grandmother's story since I was 20 years old. When I started exploring her story, it was not intended to be a decade plus long project, and end up being not only the backbone of my professional life, but also my personal life. But that is certainly what it became. And I am so grateful for the story and the way that it has opened up my eyes to so much of the world and impacted so much of my perspective. So I'm very excited to get to share some of that with you today. So, and as Diana said, I will not be able to see the chat while I am presenting, but we will have time for questions afterwards, and Diana will keep note on what comes into the chat while I talk. So we share the same sky. This has been the very large body of work that tells not only the story of my grandmother during the Holocaust, but more specifically focused for me when I started doing this work. I was really interested on her 17 years of statelessness. And that was really what drew me into her story, was wanting to understand these nearly 2 decades of her life that, she didn't have a national identity and was on this search for home. And the story is very much one that weaves through past and present. So today we're going to do a lot of looking at the past. We'll come into some of the present, and then in future programming I get to do with your community, we're going to talk a lot more about the way that this story is still playing out today, not just for me, but for many of the descendants who intersected with my grandmother during this period. So I just want to start with this piece of writing that my grandmother wrote in 1990 in her diary. And so you can read it, but I will read bits and pieces of it as well. So when I started getting interested in my grandmother's story, it started with an oral history that was very, very informal. I was in college. I was having a bit of a difficult time navigating my way through school. I grew up in Boston. My grandmother lived in the Philadelphia area. I went to school in the Philadelphia area. So that was the first time that I really got to be close to her. And it was very interesting because all my other cousins got to grow up with her as a babysitter. And as she wrote in her diaries, I discovered later on that she always used to describe being with me and my brother like tourism. So it was kind of seemingly appropriate that later on in the last year and a half before her death, we kind of went on this travel together through her stories without ever leaving her apartment outside of Philadelphia. So we started with this very informal storytelling sessions. And then after she passed away, I discovered this really gorgeous archive, which I'm going to show you bits of. And in that archive were all of her diaries. And this was one one piece that I found that she wrote in 1990, so a little bit later in her life. And my grandmother was a very vocal Holocaust survivor and would tell her story. But she would have these conversations with herself of why tell the story. So she writes, what does it mean to these young people? What impression do they walk away with? What compassion and understanding do they feel toward an unprecedented event, an incomprehensible black page in history so long, long time ago? This doesn't concern them at all. They cannot passively relate to this horror. They have their own problems to cope with, and the teenagers are in the stage of life where the most important thing is themselves. What does my life, my experience for that matter, my lost generation mean to them? And this is a piece of writing that I think about, I would say, almost daily, in the sense that I just so respect and so I've inherited this question of why does it matter? And I think that when you grow up with a survivor in your family, it almost feels like a disrespectful question, because of course it matters. But my grandmother really instilled this questioning that Jewish culture asks of us as well. And so this has really been a guiding question for me as I've moved forward throughout this work. So this is my grandmother as I remembered her. She was the most like feisty woman I knew. She used to wear a button that said, outrageous older woman. That's how she categorized herself. And she would do this thing where she ate fire. So if you've listened to the podcast, you might have heard me describe that. And this is a picture on her 85th birthday, about 3-4 months before she passes away. And she was still eating fire. So she would take her birthday candles and put it in her mouth. And either would put it out her mouth or put it out or take it out still lit. And so this was the woman that I grew up with. And, earlier on in my teenagehood, I got to experience some of her grief. And I talk about that in the book, but for the most part, she was just this joyful woman. So when I got older and started taking, this larger interest in World War II history after she passed away, it's really been this grappling with this questioning of, how does this incredibly joyful woman that I remember as being just so charismatic also carry such trauma, such hurt, such pain? And it was very known in my family growing up that she was a Holocaust survivor, and it was very known that she was the only one in her family alive at the end of the war, and she was on her own from the age of 14. So all of these things were stuff that we knew. And even when I discovered this archive after she passed away, none of this was a secret archive. This is not one of those family stories. This was just what she collected of her life, the same way that if something happened to me and someone came into my apartment, they'd find my photographs and my diaries. I mean, that's what it was. And so there's been, there's this duality that I've really, really love about, from her story and what it's taught me. And so this is my grandmother when I was young, and she starts with this beautiful, behind this picture, you'll see this handwriting. And she wrote me this gorgeous letter when I was just 3 years old in 1992. So now you know my age. But where she writes me this beautiful, like 4-page handwritten letter and tells me all about the world as it was. It was not a letter meant for a 3-year-old. It was a letter meant for somebody when they grew up. And she was telling me, about this war and, Yugoslavia and where the Olympic Games were and what was happening with Israeli politics and all of this stuff. And in that, she's writing me this story of, you're very lucky to live in this country where you feel protected, and the environment is hurting, but your parents love you and you're protected. And when you grow up and you're older, I'm going to tell you all about it. And so this was a letter that I actually found after she passed away that my mother had saved, and kind of went into this larger archive. And in this archive that I found was this folder that was labeled to me and my brother. And on it, you'll see my grandmother's handwriting, and it says, for Rachel and Jesse. So you'll know a little about my life when I was your age. Love, Mati. And we all call my grandmother Mati, which means mother in German. And so, I think there's this big question when you start to dig into your family history, particularly from, a very professionally minded space of like, what is my right to tell? And it's something that I still question and plays into every decision I make of how I retell my grandmother's story. But she left behind all of such intentional storytelling, and she was such a gifted storyteller in her own right that, finding some of these things in her archive, gave me kind of that feeling of, it's okay, I can retell her history. And this is, something that hopefully, she would approve of. And so in this folder were all types of papers and stories and photographs. But this is one of boxes upon boxes upon boxes of stuff that I've gone through and that has directed all of the travels that I've done over the past decade. So these are some of the things that I found in the archive, and I'm just going to give you a small sample of them. But there were report cards from the time that she was a kid in Czechoslovakia. She grew up in Prague, even though she was born in a town called Kolín, which was about 45 minutes away. When she was 1 year old, her family moved her to Prague. There were pieces of writing from when she was learning English. There were her parents' deportation papers. There were her birth certificates. On the bottom right here, you'll see this little packet and what this little book, and inside of there were signatures of her friends from Sweden when she left to come to America. So these things span this entire, first 25 years of her life when she was in Europe, and envelopes with addresses. So after these storytelling sessions that I had with my grandmother from 2009 to 2010, when I was in college, after that, when she passed away and I discovered this archive, I spent about 4 years on my bedroom floor in Boston, doing what all young creatives do, which is like working in the restaurant industry and photographing weddings and working in the travel industry and just doing, whatever I could to make ends meet. And I was doing some teaching at Hebrew schools. And all the meanwhile, what felt like my primary job was going through this archive. And so I digitized every single thing. I scanned all the photographs until I discovered a whole box that had not been scanned yet. So even many, many years later, I'm still discovering things, which is makes me feel a little crazy sometimes, but also very, very exciting. And so I digitized everything. I scanned everything and, high resolution, this or that. And I retyped every single diary. And so I had this very intimate experience with all of my grandmother's words. And, we had diaries of hers from during the war, when she was a young refugee in Scandinavia. We had them translated. And, but later in her life, when she was writing in English, all these handwritten journals that spanned from, her entire adult married, divorced, and married again life, I was retyping it. So I really got, very close with her story that way. And so these are some of the photographs as well. And these gorgeous photographs. It was incredible that she kept all of this. And the way that she would write many of her writings was as if she thought somebody might read it. So I don't know if any of you all do that when you write in your own journals or diaries, but she would like describe characters as if she was writing for an audience. So it was very helpful for me. And while I was doing all this, I was very determined to be a photojournalist. From the time I was in college, I was like, I'm going to work as a photojournalist. And I always carried this big DSLR camera with me everywhere I went. And I lived in Israel for a year and started working at a photo agency there. And so I was really determined for this. So the whole time as I'm starting to go into my grandmother's story, it was from this idea of like, I'm going to do something with this as a photojournalism project. Which trying to pitch in the photojournalism world, especially as a young person with very little resume behind me, was quite difficult, because the big question was, how are you going to photograph the past? And I didn't quite have an answer for it. I don't even know if I still have a good answer for it, but I just knew I was going to do it. And so meanwhile, like I'm going through all these documents, I'm going through all these photographs. My grandmother was so good about captioning things with years and names and dates. And I essentially created this huge puzzle of her life, this itinerary, and really was focusing on where was she during these 2 decades of statelessness? How did she get from one place to another? Who is she with? And every little piece just kind of entered. And so meanwhile, I'm conceptualizing, okay, like, how am I going to go out and do this? So before I tell you about some of that story, I just want to let you hear some of her voice. There's going to be little bits of audio throughout here, some that come directly from the podcast, but all come from her voice that you'll hear will come from her testimony that she gave to USC Shoah Foundation in 1998. So if any of you have watched any testimony from Shoah Foundation, you might know that at the end they ask survivors to bring photographs that are important to them and describe them, which is such an incredible tool when you're taking someone's personal history. And so this is what she had to say about this photograph.
This picture was even in the newspaper in Prague, and it was, first it was like a quiz show. There are 3 mothers and 3 grandmothers and 3 daughters and 1 great-grandmother and 1 great-granddaughter. How many people all together? And the next day it was like the picture in Prague. So I'm really very proud of that picture, and I'm so happy that I have it. On the right is my great-grandmother, Rajchová. Then is my grandmother, my mother's mother, Maria Fialová. Then it's my mother, I think she was 23 years old. Then Emilia Dubová, and then it's me, Hanna Dubová. All except me perished in concentration camp.
And this is one of the photographs that will also be hanging in your community soon. And so I'll tell you which photographs you might see in the synagogue. So I'm in my early part of my mid-20s, very dedicated to this idea of being a photojournalist, incredibly dedicated to my grandmother's story. I would very easily use the word obsession. And so I conceptualized this whole project that I was going to go out for a year and I was going to retrace her story. And I kind of had this naive idea that I was like, oh, I'll travel for a year and then I'm going to publish a book. Well, this started in 2013, 2014, and it's now 2022. So it took a little bit longer than I thought, for a very good reason, a very meaningful reason. But this was the idea when I started to go out. So I thought, I'm going to retrace my grandmother's 17 years of statelessness. And I was very aware, I was not trying to replicate it. I just wanted to understand the languages that she lived in. And I wanted to see the landscape, and I wanted to immerse myself in the type of lives she lived in, because my grandmother was saved during the war by the kindness of strangers. And she told her history in this way that it was an uplifting history. And I've thoughts on that about, how much of that was because she really believed it and how much of it was, a protection from the past in some way. That's a larger conversation that if anybody here is going to take the family history telling workshop, we're going to talk about some of that. But, I really wanted to be there. As a photographer, you have to show up. So if I wanted to write a book about my grandmother's history, I wouldn't actually have to be there. I could have written that from my bedroom floor, no problem. But that's not what I was interested in doing. I really wanted to be there. So I had to start in Prague. That's where my grandmother grew up. And in 1939, my grandmother was 13, going on 14. She was 13 when the Nazis invaded and her Czech citizenship was taken away. And she was 14 when World War II officially began and when she was able to get out and flee for safety. So when I was in Prague, I spent, it was a very lonely, difficult period for me, but I spent a lot of time looking at the Jewish community there. My grandmother was very insistent on letting me know that she grew up very secular, that they didn't speak Yiddish and that they didn't keep kosher. And they went to, she referred to herself as a high holiday Jew. And her 3 children all raised their children as different, with different religious practices. So my family was the Reform one. So I think part of the reason she was very adamant about that, because it was a relatable piece for me, because that was how my family grew up, where my cousins were all more religious. And so I spent this time there, and it was a really interesting time to figure out what is the Jewish community like in this space where my family once lived. And what I discovered that, all my family history there was murdered, and so I would find my family's names on the walls of museums. This is the Pinkas Synagogue, if anybody's been to Prague, where all the walls are lined with Jewish victims from Prague and greater parts of what's now Czech Republic. And, so it was this very strange space to be in, this highly tourist driven city. Prague's a great city to be a tourist in, but I'm walking around just kind of seeing everything in black and white and taking stock of this is where my grandmother came from. And this is the last place that she ever saw her family. And so she told me when we were talking, I last saw my parents on the platform of the train station. I thought the war will be over soon. I never believed, and I don't think they ever believed, that this is the last time that we see each other. And I think that this is where my grandmother had a really great gift as a storyteller, and where I think she's given me some good training, or I would like to give her credit, where she was so good about thinking about her audience and the way she told her story. And the way that she told her story to me was as if she didn't know what was happening next. And I think that's been something that's sat with me in a very important way of understanding Holocaust history, of they didn't know what was happening next. As a grandchild, I know everything that happened next. And so you tell the story differently, knowing what was coming. And for her, she was 14 years old. The way my grandmother was able to escape Prague in October of 1939, so about a month after the war begins, is that she was able to get what she called a lottery ticket. It was not actually a lottery ticket, but that's how she saw it, to go to Denmark, which was by virtue of being in the Zionist youth movement, which she was very passionate about. And so this cohort of Czech Jewish teens between the ages of 14 and 16 were taken to Denmark with intention of putting them on farms, having them learn agricultural skills, and eventually going on to Palestine. And that was the idea. And so that's how she was able to leave. And my grandmother was so dedicated to her youth group. I mean, these were all her best friends. She like loved the pioneering spirit. And her first boyfriend was going, who she had just gotten her first kiss when she was 14 on her 14th birthday. That story is told in the podcast. And so she was excited, and she told me, she said, I felt like I was going on a big adventure. And it was a very different way of, that's not the how you think that the narrative begins. But she took me on this journey with her. And of course, I'm sure her parents knew in a much more serious way what was happening, and her younger brother was too young to go, but she really believed that she would see them again. So anyways, this is the last picture of the four of them that I have. It was taken shortly before she left, and you'll see there on the bottom right is the train station in Prague that she left from. So I'll let you read this while I talk. And this comes from a piece of writing that my grandmother wrote in 2004. And she took a class that was like a memoir writing class, and she would write these essays. So a lot of the reflections I have of hers are very interesting, because I have the letters. We'll talk about letters in a moment, but I have the letters that she exchanged between her and her parents during this period. So I have the letters that she was writing them on this journey out. But then I also have these reflections, these incredible, beautifully written reflections when she's in her 70s and 80s, where she's reflecting on this. And so for me, it became very interesting to understand how that memory changed as time moved forward. And she tells the story differently, and it's been a very unique way to understand the story of history, to see how the perspective has changed as the years went on. So this is a piece of writing that comes from an essay called Stepping Stones in My Life, where she writes about leaving Prague and getting on the train. And she goes through Berlin, she goes through the German countryside. She talks about how scared she was to hand in her passport. And eventually she gets to the coast of Warnemünde, Germany. And from Warnemünde, she gets on a boat and goes to Denmark. So this is from me following her journey out. So I did the same thing. So I spent time in Prague, and then I did this, very intentional with just a little backpack 2-day journey where I followed exactly how she got out of Prague. And I did the same stops at the train stations where I could, depending on some things have, of course, changed in the 75 years since. And from Germany, took a boat over to Denmark. And so my grandmother gets to Denmark in October of 1939. At this point, Denmark is still a free country. It is not occupied yet by the Nazis. And so this is safety. And this is all these Czech kids come, and they eventually get put on different foster farms. And so I'm going to show you some of these photographs that I have that I think are just absolutely stunning. And a few of these will be in the exhibit as well. Of all of, they call them the Chaverin, the friends. And this would really became my grandmother's family. And so all of these young people, were placed on different farms, and they had their different lives. But then every couple of weeks, they would be able to get together and speak in their native language and compare how they were doing in learning Danish. And they would get to, practice Jewish culture together, and they would flirt. And I love having my grandmother's diaries from this period, because, coming into this, knowing that I'm telling a story that, is so deeply rooted in the Holocaust, it was kind of when I started going through her diaries and realizing that so many of them were about her, gossiping about her friends, and, her and her boyfriend break up, and she's going through that heartache, and she likes him and she doesn't like him. And then, this friend is stupid, and this is her best friend. And all these very, very typical teenage human emotions that were just so relatable. And so these were, this is everything she was experiencing during the war. and the kids would get together. And they still had this intention of going on to Palestine. A few, I think there were 2 boats of kids who were able to go, but for the most part, they all end up staying in Denmark, because Denmark is then occupied by the Nazis in April of 1940. And just as the years go on, it becomes increasingly difficult to travel. And so my grandmother starts to accept that, she realized she's not going back to, Czechoslovakia anytime soon. She's exchanging letters with her parents. And she's also realizing she's probably not going to Palestine. And so, as time goes on, some of that sense of adventure that I mentioned that she had starts to wane. And I'll let you read this as well while I talk over it a bit. And so her diaries start to change as well. And I have to say that as I've grown older and I keep returning to her writings, I take, a lot of different things away from them as the years have passed. But what I really love about this excerpt, which is written in September of 1940, so just about a year after she gets to Denmark, is that you start to see this longing for her family coming in, but she's also balancing it with this pride of her independence. And she's like loving the work on the farm. And I think she's, appreciating this challenge that she's in, but she also starts to feel this longing. So you start to see her growing up through these writings. And, I love this line where she says, not that I wouldn't be independent or missed her helpful hands at work. No, there's something else that's lacking, and that's a mother herself. I think that especially in my age, when I am growing up, I need a mother the most. So as I said, my grandmother was exchanging letters with her parents during this time. These are the envelopes from some of those letters, and you'll actually see on the back of them that it's stamped, with the Nazi seal of approval. And so, every letter was censored. So they would get these letters, but, lines were blocked out. But as long as the letters were coming, she knew that her family was alive. But they're giving her little bits of information. So one family is gone and another one left and another was taken away, and the grandmother moves in, and so the dehumanization is moving forward, and stripping them of their livelihood in all these ways. But she was just getting little bits and pieces, and then she was writing letters back from the farm and what her life was like. So I'm going to give you a moment to listen to her talk about these letters. You might notice, if you've listened to the podcast, there's a little bit of this in the first episode, but this is a clip from my grandmother's testimony with USC Shoah Foundation that she gave in 1998.
What were your parents saying about their lives in Prague?
I still have all the letters from my parents after all these years, and I promised myself I will translate them to English. I start and then I stop, and then a year later I start and I stop. I just don't know. I really haven't finished it. I knew, as I told you before, there was another family moved in. I knew that my grandparents were gone. I knew that the business was gone. I knew from my brother, he says, maybe I lived to my bar mitzvah. I mean, even though we were secular, it was really one of the milestones in your life. He was learning his Torah portion. I don't know how but that never came to pass. I knew it was bad. But nobody ever in the wildest dream thought about what we know today about concentration camp. It was the most fun. I mean, horror movies that existed, Frankenstein existed, but nobody would ever imagine anything like this, ever, in your wildest dream. It was beyond. And that's, I think, what was so successful. That was beyond understanding, behind comprehension.
So eventually the letters stopped coming. And in one of the last letters that my grandmother sends back home, she writes this: "You cannot imagine how important is a place where people live, how much influence it gives, how it is transforming. Here I am walking every day and I do not miss anything. Of course, it is not perfect, but when I came here, I felt like home. It is so fine like home, so trustful and open. I don't have any other word than home. This is in July of 1941. My grandmother has just turned 16 years old. And in the 2 years prior, every 6 months, she was moved to a different family, in these foster family. And a lot of these women were part of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is an organization that still exists today. And so they were willing to take in these kids, and they would get them as farm helps. And so in exchange for room and board, they would help out in the home and on the farm. And you can see in my grandmother's diaries that the way that the people who had these farms, the way that they treated her, changed her experience so much with being a refugee. And so a lot of my work has really focused on how ordinary acts by individuals during extraordinary times can really change the course of history. And you start to see this playing out, because you start to see her misery becoming very different based on just how people treat her on the day to day. So prior to being in this home where she's writing this beautiful piece about, she was in this home where in her diary, and she's constantly calling the woman an old witch, and she kind of hates her, and she's relegated to eating alone. And, she's sleeping in this room in the attic that's unheated. And she talks about, her breath freezing in the middle of the night. And she had to sleep with like a piece of coal wrapped in a newspaper to stay warm. And she really was treated like a servant. She was the help. And she hated it. And my grandmother, one thing that's very consistent from her childhood through to the day she died, was that she had a lot of chutzpah. And she had a lot of will to say what she wanted, even during a time of war. As a granddaughter, it was very embarrassing at certain times. Now that I'm older, I respect it deeply. But so she actually goes to this organization during these years of war, when she firmly understands like how lucky she is to be in this place. And she says, I'm really unhappy. Can I move to this other farm? I know that there was a kid there and they just left, and they said, she managed to make it work. So she ends up moving to this farm with this woman, Jensine Nugart. And that's where this photograph is taken. And what I love about a lot of these photographs, and the ones that you saw previously of the Chavarim, is that this is not the association you make with what a refugee looks like, particularly in the context of how we talk about refugees today. And I really appreciate how my grandmother's story has forced me to really make sure I don't get stuck in these types of expectations of what a certain experience during a war is, because while she's going through all this separation from her family and this fear and this pain and every horrible emotion that I can't even name or understand, she's also going through very typical growing up experiences. And this family who takes her in really allows her to embrace that, which changes her whole experience. So coming to present day a little bit, this photograph is taken in 2013. And this is my mother and me. My mother is hugging this woman named Jensine, who took in my grandmother during World War II. So through a long, tangled, wonderful world of journalism, something had been put in a local Danish newspaper by a Czech journalist who was doing this big story about the group of kids that my grandmother left with. And she and I had been in touch because I had been already working on this project. And basically, this man who you see in the corner here on the left, Knut Arne, he read this article and said, "Oh my God, this sounds like my family story," and reaches out to the Czech journalist and says, "Was there a girl named Hannah who was, part of this cohort?" And the Czech journalist says, "Yes." And suddenly my family is now in connection here. And you hear my mom and him telling the story a little bit in the podcast, because it was such an incredible ordeal that we had suddenly, by no doing of my own, unfortunately, I wish I could take credit for it, had connected with this family where this is the woman who made my grandmother feel like home. And what I started to learn was that this story that I was quite possessive over, because it was my family history, had been passed down in their story from generation to generation in the same way it had been passed down in my family. So this is where we start to build out this whole cast of wonderful humans who you start to realize are carrying this history in such meaningful ways, but from such different perspectives. And that's where my own work starts to shift a lot, is embracing that and trying to figure out like how all of that works together in this really beautiful, meaningful, harmonious way. So going along my journey and, with this, intention of living similarly as much as I can to the way my grandmother did, when I went to Denmark, like I had to go live on a farm. That's what I had to do. And so I reached out to Knut Arne and I said, can I go live with a family member? A lot of his family members were still farmers. So he puts me in touch with Sine. She's the one we see in the back here, and her family. And this is her farm in Denmark. This photograph is from March 2015. It will also be in the exhibit. It's one of my absolute favorite photographs I think I've ever taken. And this is Sine. And so I moved in with the granddaughter of my grandmother's foster mother from World War II. And I moved in with intention for 5 weeks. I literally just emailed her when I was like on this year-long journey in Europe. And I said, hi, I'm Rachel, and I'm, this photographer from America, and I'm doing this project with my grandmother, and your grandmother helped my grandmother during the war. Like, can I come live with you? And she was like, sure. And I was like, you have any questions? And she was like, no. And I was like, all right, see you in a month. And so her family took me in, and they had this incredible organic farm. And I pretty much said, I just kind of want to work, and I want to get to know you, and I want to photograph my time and maybe write about it. And in exchange, what can I do to help? And so in the morning, I would help Sine in the barn, and she always make fun of me because I was like, like scooping poop and helping in the barn. And I grew up in the inner city of Boston. Like now I, live in Maine and like am very attached to like quiet living. But at that time I was still like very much a committed city kid, and always like with this big camera still next to me. And she like thought I was ridiculous, like trying to shovel stuff while also trying to take pictures of everything. But that was my job. And then in the evenings, I was responsible for cooking dinner for the family. And so every single night I got to have a family meal. And like, in your 20s, that's not something that gets to happen very often, especially when you're, kind of a nomadic storyteller. It's a pretty lonesome existence. And so here on this place in kind of the middle of nowhere, I was so deeply attached to history that was telling such a different such a different perspective of the same story, because as they told me, Knut Arne told me, Sine told me, in their family, this was a good story. And immediately that's a complicated feeling, because you're like, how could this story be a good story? But for them, their family history told a story that during World War II, when the Jews were being persecuted, when the Jews were being murdered, they took in a young woman named Hannah, and they didn't know what happened to her after the war, but they saved her. They contributed to her being alive. And for them, that was such a point of pride, and it was such an identity. So there, dozens and dozens and dozens of family members that exist now, from the older generation to the great grandchildren of this history, had heard about my grandmother. And so our stories just started to intersect in this really beautiful way. And I ended up, I'm not going to go deep into my own personal history during this presentation. We'll talk about it more when I'm there for the book talk. But I actually ended up getting married on this farm, or at least celebrating my wedding on this farm. And my husband passed away soon after that. And this is where I grieved on this farm too. So I went for 5 weeks to go live on this farm, thinking that I came in as a journalist. And I left so close as family that actually for the many years that followed during my milestone moments, both celebratory and grief-driven moments, this was the place I went, and they always welcomed me back, and our families became friends. So this whole history just started to shift entirely and completely. And so these are some of the photographs, and I started to develop this great relationship with their kids, who are all older now. So it's really special. And you get to meet them throughout the podcast and the book. So I could do a whole presentation on them. I love this family, and I love living on this farm, and I miss Denmark a lot. So let's go back into history. A big part of the work that I do is on rescue missions, and particularly the rescue of the Danish Jews is kind of my big area of focus, because that's what my grandmother went through. So 1942, my grandmother is realizing that, she's been on this farm. Schooling was taken away from her when she was 13. That was, the first thing that the Nazis took away was schooling. And my grandmother's a beautiful essay where she talks about, that's when the war came to her. And she talks about in her testimony as well, that the war came to her when she wasn't allowed to go to school anymore. And so she tells the farmer that she's living with at this point, I want to go back to school. And they say, you can go back to school and you have to find a place to go. So she ends up writing to boarding schools throughout Denmark and saying, I'll work in exchange for an education. And one school, a finishing school, actually says yes. And so she ends up going to this finishing school where she's like, the true Cinderella, as she calls herself, where, she's scrubbing the toilets and cleaning the walls and, has this one ratty uniform and is with very well-to-do Danish women, and essentially being taught at the school, like how to, run a household and direct the maid. And meanwhile, she is the maid. And so this is that group of kids. And she has this beautiful story about how she really believed that these girls hated her. And she talks about it, I had an accent, I was the other, I was the one who, didn't have a clean uniform and all of this stuff. And she says that one year on Christmas, all of the girls got together and bought her a silver ring and textbooks, because she didn't have textbooks. She was copying everything by hand. And she learned this really important lesson in her life of like, it's so important, the stories that we tell ourselves, because so often it's not reality. And what's interesting to me is that she also passed down to me, this thing that her father passed down to her, which is what's in your head, no one can take away from you. And that's why she wanted so badly to go back to school, was to keep learning, and education was so important. So she learned these two important lessons about what's in your head. It's like, one, nobody can take it away from you, but also sometimes, you're constructing stories for yourselves. And so, this is how she would talk about her past when she would tell me her story. So yeah, this is her. She's on the left there in the back. So she goes to this school, and after she graduates, she has to figure out what to do. So she gets hired as a maid in a banker's family. And this is where the story gets very dramatic, as she told me, where it's 1943 now. The war's turning. The Germans aren't doing so great. They're losing. Denmark, up until this point, had been a pretty safe place for the Jews. They weren't deported. There's a lot there that I'm not going to go into because you'll be here for a whole history lesson with me, but it's an incredible story how Denmark stood up for their Jewish population, and really the whole like humanity and philosophy behind it is that like they were like, well, they're Danes, and they also were very adamant. They were like, we don't care if the Jews here came as refugees, like they're living on Danish soil, we're going to protect them as Danes. And so in August 1943, Denmark is no longer getting preferential treatment. And there were a number of reasons it was getting preferential treatment by the Germans. Hitler essentially saw Denmark as being, the ideal German protectorate after the war. Like they were Aryan, but also there was a lot of food production happening there. So when martial law comes in, this notion that the Jews are going to be kind of spared there is over. They're going to deport them. And this plan is going around that they're going to deport the Jews in fall of 1943 from Denmark. And actually, it's a German officer, which I think is a really remarkable part of the story, is that a German officer leaks the information to the Danish government. And what comes after that is a spontaneous act of humanity that saves 95% of the Jewish population. So as my grandmother was telling this story, and I'll say I grew up knowing that my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. I grew up, like I said, in the inner city of Boston where there were not a lot of Jews. I can't say I like really embraced that part of my identity until I got older, but I always knew that there was this like heroic story of my grandmother, escaping Denmark on a fishing boat and, fleeing from the Nazis. Then also a lot of young kids read Number the Stars. And so that was a story that was similar. But when I was taking my grandmother's story, these storytelling sessions, she tells me that like, I was at this banker's family and, there comes a knock on the door and this guy on a bike who she had never seen before and never sees after comes and says, do you have a Jewish servant here? And the banker says, yes, little Hannah. And he comes and he says to my grandmother, do you have a bike? She says, yes. And he says, get on the bike and follow me. So my grandmother follows him to a church by the coast. And she said the minister of the church took her up to the bell tower and she was told to wait for the signal and cover her ears when the church bell was rung. And, at this point, she doesn't really understand what she's running from. She has no idea what she's running to. She has no idea what's about to happen. She says, we ran to the beach, we hid in the sand under the upside down rowboats. This is when the signal comes, which is 3 days later. Also, the fishermen wanted some financial compensation for bringing us to Sweden. So we got the signal and ran from the upside down rowboats to the fishing boat, which was supposed to take us to Sweden. And she thought, the fisherman isn't going to take me. She said, I have no money. And she pulls her pockets inside out to show him. And he looks at her in the eye and says, I didn't ask you, did I? Hop on board. And so this is my grandmother's like epic story of escape in 1943 that she told me. And as a child, I carried with me so deeply. And what had happened during this rescue was that in the course of 3 weeks, it was from the bottom up, not leadership down, countrymen and countrywomen of Denmark got together and spontaneously, in this heroic fashion, were able to get over 7,000 Jewish people, their spouses, members of the underground, over to Sweden, which was neutral during the war. And it was a very expensive crossing. And it was in some cases, a very short trip. In my grandmother's case, the boat got lost, and she ended up being at sea for 19 hours, lost at sea. And the reality was that the fisherman had never gone further than he could see the coast. And had they ended up anywhere but Sweden, they most likely would have been killed, if not, maybe deported, or they would have drowned. So there's just such huge stakes. But they do make it to Sweden. And in this course, let me go back here for a second. They do make it to Sweden, and it's this like epic story and this incredible act. Denmark is the only country to be righteous among the nations as a country because of this rescue. And so my grandmother's on this boat, and she's telling me this story, and she's saying, I was on this boat and there were 19 of us, and she's just turned 18 at this point now. This is her second time fleeing. She doesn't know where any of the kids are that she left Czechoslovakia with. But she says, I was on this boat, and there was this very prominent rabbi on this boat from the Melchior family. And she's telling me about them and everything. So when I go to Denmark, I have to find this family, and they became chief rabbis after the war, and they were a legacy family. So I reach out to the Jewish community, same way I reached out to Sine, kind of told them a little bit of the story, and I am then introduced to Rabbi Ben Melchior, who you see here in this photograph. And I met him around the same time I met Sine and her family in early winter of 2015 in February. And I came into his house in Copenhagen and kind of had this really bold statement of like, you and my grandmother were on this boat together in 1943 and you escaped. And, we started to match up details of the story. And there's some things that were kind of off, but enough was in place. And the specifics that were in place, we really were like, oh, it must have been. And so once again, I walked into his house as a journalist, and I left his family because Rabbi Ben Melchior, who very sadly passed away this past summer, he became a grandfather to me. And so he became somebody who, I visited him every time I was in Denmark. We became incredibly close with each other. And it was really remarkable to me because when my grandmother died, I really thought I had lost the opportunity to talk to people who were there. And then going on this journey, I just kept finding people. And he and I got really close. And, after my husband passed away, he became, a hugely important person for me to go and ask really complicated questions to. And then when his wife passed away, he and I would have all these really deep conversations. And I just feel so grateful for the way that he, added all these layers to my life and to my grandmother's story. So I miss him a lot. But so I met him, he says to me, when our boat got to Sweden, we were lingering at sea. We didn't know where we were. We were, we're terrified. It was a foggy day, and he tells me this whole story that there was this 7-year-old boy, it was his birthday, who was playing soccer on the shore and saw our boat out at sea, ran and tells his father. And his father, who was a fisherman, grabs a neighbor, and they row their rowboat out to this boat and see all these refugees coming out from the fog as they get closer and whisper these, they're not whisper, they say these 3 very important words to the people on boat, which is welcome to Sweden. And so Rabbi Ben Melchior tells me, I'm still friends with this family of this fisherman. So, never a connection I thought I would ever make. And so a few weeks after meeting Bent, end up on the shores of southern Sweden, exactly where this boat came to shore. So I'm going to let you hear Bent talking about this right now. This is just a small snippet from the podcast.
When I'm standing there at the beach, looking at that water, I see myself on the bottom of that sea.
So this is this home in southern Sweden. And I know we're a little bit tight on time here, so I'm going to wrap up the story soon, and we'll can get to Q&A. But this is Per Arne, and Per Arne was the 7-year-old boy who saw the boat. And as Bent said, he really did a good deed without knowing he did a good deed. And so every year on the anniversary of this rescue, Bent's mother would send correspondence to Per Arne's mother, and they became lifelong friends. And unfortunately, Per Arne passed away a couple years ago, as did his wife, who really took this history on as her own. And going into their home, I became very close with them. And going into their home, it was like a museum to this history. And it was incredible because it was just this little humble home in the coast of southern Sweden that my grandmother had walked into. And he still lived in the same home, but all over the walls were photographs and newspaper clippings, and they kept every piece of correspondence laminated. And, so what happens is that, like, I went out in search of my grandmother's story, and I kept finding all these people who were passing down a version of the same story from their family. And so you started to meet all these descendants who had inherited this history in so many different ways. And this house was so remarkable. And Bent and I actually traveled there together in, I believe it was 2017. It was great. He was like 88 years old and drove me in his car that was from the same year that I was born, from Denmark to Sweden. And we had this like kind of epic adventure. Neither of us had a cell phone or GPS, and just this printout from like MapQuest, if you remember what that is, with, we were in Sweden, the directions were in Danish. I was navigating. I don't speak either of those languages. And we just like had this whole travel adventure together to go and visit this family. And we all got to be together and eat sweets and talk about history. And so before I wrap up this presentation, I just want to leave you with some words that Bent said about this home and what it was like to go inside of this home, that really their entire identity, to the point that 75 years later, what was on their walls was about this history. And so this is what he had to say.
It is something outstanding. You enter this place, it's not a big place, and you feel something special because they collected every little bit, every note in any newspaper. And all the small things that my mother used to send them on the anniversary of our coming there, it is in a shrine. It smells of here, something happened. A place is not holy by itself. It's a question of the people that are there that make the place a holy place. It is the actions by human beings that can change a place from a normal house into a holy place. And I think that is the kind of feeling I have to enter this little house.
Yeah, that's a short clip from the podcast. So I'm going to kind of end the presentation here, but the story goes much further. So my grandmother's in Sweden, 1943 to the end of the war. At the end of the war, she, goes back to Denmark and then eventually goes to Prague, to confirm the deaths of her family and to find out what happened. And her parents and brother, amongst other family members, were first sent to Theresienstadt and then to Sobibor, where they were murdered almost immediately, one could assume. And so, in my work, I went to all those places as well. I didn't talk about it tonight, but it's in the podcast and the book, because I really do believe that while I like to focus on rescue missions, and I'm really taken by the way that individual acts of kindness have this, echo throughout history, I don't believe it's possible to understand these stories, these rare stories of light, unless you understand just how dark this period was. And so, that's has to be understood as the backdrop, and why we remember. So, my grandmother's, in this question mark after the war, like every survivor, is what do I do now? Where do I go? What is home? And eventually in 1950, my grandmother does come to America, and I follow her story to America, and I follow her all the way across America by train. She first goes down to Cincinnati, and I tell a story through my work that she had this very very intense experience learning about racism towards Black people in America, because, it was, the close to the South, Cincinnati, in 1950, and has to learn to be part of a culture that has a whole different set of prejudices. So I follow her there because my grandmother spent her first 6 years in America, not as an American citizen. So the story continues, but for the sake of time, I'm going to end it there. And I just want to end with a piece of my grandmother's writing. Like 15 years before she passed away, she went to a funeral of a friend and really didn't like the eulogy. She felt like it wasn't personal. So she went home and wrote her own eulogy. And the whole eulogy is in the book. But I just wanted to end with this little piece, which is, she writes, "We all live on borrowed time. Our lives are temporary, and most of us try to do our best to our parents, our siblings, our spouses, our children and grandchildren, our friends, and our community. Some of us succeed for the most part. We do have the strength and the optimism to hope, to go on, to be productive, to be concerned, to love, to discipline, to rejoice, and to support. We are putting our hopes in our children and the future generations. They will have the same struggles, agonies, and pleasures we had. However, they cannot learn it through us. They have to experience all of the emotions, from exhilarating to mournful ones, on their own. All we can do is instill in the new generation a moral fiber, sense of justice, loyalty, love for learning, awe of nature, respect for each other, enjoy life's pleasures, and cope with setbacks. All this we give through love and example." So say, when we think about the fact that it's International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and every day throughout the year, when we think about our history, I really believe in my grandmother's words that we learn history to, instill in this new generation, in our generation, this moral fiber, to make sure that never again is not just for us, but for everybody. So with that, I'm going to end. I know I'm running up on our time here. I thought I was going to end a little bit sooner, but I'm happy to have conversations. And I just want to thank all of you. And I really look forward to, coming and visiting your community soon.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing Hannah's remarkable story with us tonight. Thank you, Nima and James, for handling all the tech behind the scenes. And most importantly, thank all of you for being with us to experience and listen to Hannah's story, and also honor International Holocaust Remembrance Day with us. So on behalf of TIOH Arts and Culture and Temple Israel of Hollywood, I want to extend warm wishes of care and comfort to you and yours. Thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you, everybody.